Sergeant Ethan Harper stepped out of his cruiser with his hand already on the gun and shouted, "Show me your hands, or I swear I'll drop you right here." His voice cracked through the night with a violence that left no space for reason. Major Jamal Washington lifted his head from the flat tire he had been helping a stranded student change, the dress uniform still crisp from the long day at Fort Cavazos. Jamal didn't move fast. He didn't posture. He simply turned in the calm way a man turns when he has nothing to hide. Ethan didn't care. He saw the uniform, then the skin beneath it, and his grip tightened. The 8 seconds that followed would later be replayed in conference rooms, prayer circles, and quiet living rooms across the country. Ethan never asked for identification. Jamal offered it anyway. The military ID shined under the cruiser headlights, yet Ethan's eyes refused to see it. His voice carried the weight of old hatred as he said, "Another fake in costume." 3 shots tore through the silence. Jamal staggered. A hand pressed against the holes blooming across his chest, and he dropped onto the yellow stripe dividing the road. Ethan stared down at him and let out a short laugh. "One less faker on my road." The words hung in the air with a coldness that would haunt every person who later heard them. Above the highway, a young black college student froze on an overpass, phone shaking in his hand as he captured the moment that would define the rest of his short life. Before we go further into this story, tell me where you're watching from today, and if this kind of real-life justice storytelling means something to you. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give me a like. It helps more than you know, and it keeps stories like this from being buried. When the shots ended, the world around them held its breath. Ethan stood over Jamal's body as if waiting for gratitude, as if expecting applause for a victory no one asked him to claim. Jamal's breaths came heavy and slow, each one sounding like a man fighting to hold on, even when he knew there was nothing left to hold. For a moment, he saw not the highway, but the memory that lived in the back of his mind, the memory that had shaped him since 2004. Fallujah, fire swallowing the Humvee, 11 men trapped inside, the heat so fierce it peeled the paint off helmets, Jamal dragging body after body out of the flames, lungs burning, skin blistering, refusing to stop even when everyone else expected him to fall. The last man he pulled from that hell was Colonel Lucas Reyes. Younger then, terrified then, certain he would die until Jamal threw him over his shoulder and carried him 400 yards through open fire. Jamal had been called the Rock ever since, not because he was unbreakable, but because he refused to break when others needed him whole. Now, on this highway, with blood spreading across his uniform, Jamal wanted to believe the world he fought for would see him as he was, a soldier, a protector, a man who spent his life lifting others out of the fire. But Ethan Harper saw none of that. Ethan's face twisted with the same bitterness he inherited from a father who taught him that uniforms meant nothing if the skin beneath them didn't match his idea of America. Ethan reached down and nudged Jamal's identification card with his boot, as if the truth printed on it offended him. "I knew it," he muttered. "Another trick." His voice shook with the hollow confidence of a man who needed his hatred to feel like purpose. The stranded student stood frozen by his car, unable to move, unable to breathe, watching the man who had stopped to help him bleed out on the road. Jamal had changed his tire without asking for money, without asking for thanks, offering that calm smile of his that made strangers feel safe. Now the boy's hands trembled so violently he dropped his phone twice before managing to dial 911. His voice cracked as he whispered, "He didn't do anything. He didn't do anything." But the dispatcher on the other end spoke with the tired detachment of someone who had heard too many versions of the same story. Across the barrier, the young college student on the overpass kept filming even as tears rolled down his face. He zoomed in on Jamal's body, zoomed in on Ethan's smirk, zoomed in on the ID card that proved everything. He didn't know the danger he was placing himself in. He didn't know that what he held in his trembling hands had the power to shake the country. He only knew he couldn't stop recording, because silence had killed too many people who looked like him. The footage captured Jamal lifting one final breath. His lips moved, forming the beginning of a sentence, but the words never made it past the air. Ethan bent over him, searching for something. Fear, defiance, regret. But Jamal met his eyes with a quiet steadiness that unsettled the sergeant. That calm, unwavering look said more than any protest could. It said, "I know what you did, and the world will know too." The world did know. For a moment. When the ambulance arrived 18 minutes later, Jamal was still alive, though fading fast. The paramedics worked with the frantic urgency of people who knew they were losing a man who deserved every chance. Jamal tried to speak, but the words came out as broken breaths. They loaded him into the ambulance and sped toward Memorial Hermann Hospital, unaware that the chart waiting for him would read John Doe, possible impersonator. Unaware that a deep fake would soon rewrite him as the aggressor. Unaware that the truth was already being buried. Back on the highway, Ethan sat in his cruiser with the windows up, staring at his shaking hands. For the first time, the adrenaline wore off, and a small crack of fear slipped into his expression. Not guilt, not remorse. Fear. Fear that the world might not see the story the way his father raised him to believe it. Fear that the uniform he wore would not shield him from the consequences of what he had done. But the fear faded as quickly as it came, by the time the second responding unit arrived. Ethan had rebuilt the mask he wore every day. He stepped out of the cruiser, gestured toward the body that had already been taken away, and said with cold certainty, "Suspect reached for a weapon." The other officers nodded without asking a single question. Above them, on the overpass, the student held his phone close to his chest. He knew this video would change his life. He didn't know it would also end it, and far away. In a quiet office in Fort Cavazos, General Lucas Reyes felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his chest, sensing in a way only soldiers understand that the man who once carried him through fire had just taken his last breath. The video hit the internet before dawn, and for a brief, electric window of time. The truth was undeniable. It spread through phones, message threads, and quiet midnight living rooms with the force of something people had been waiting years to witness. 350,000 shares in 5 hours. Mothers shaking their heads in disbelief. Veterans standing still in their kitchens. Fists tightening at the sight of a soldier in dress uniform dropping to the ground without a chance to speak. Pastors watching the clip twice, then 3 times, before whispering a single prayer. Ethan Harper's face was clear. His voice was clear. The ID was clear. The laughter was clear. Nothing about it required interpretation. Nothing required debate. It was all there. And then, almost as fast as it appeared, the video began to disappear. Links broke. Reposts froze. Screens flashed with error messages, one by one. Social media platforms removed the footage with vague explanations about sensitive content and pending review. The truth that had burned so brightly started flickering, then faded under a coordinated sweep that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. The young student who filmed it sat alone in his dorm room as the notifications slowed. His phone buzzed with messages from strangers thanking him for his courage, but fear tightened around his chest in a way he couldn't shake. A campus police officer had already knocked on his door once, asking questions that felt too specific. By late afternoon, the pressure of what he had seen and what he had captured grew too heavy for a 19-year-old boy to carry. Before sunset, he was found hanging in his closet, the phone still on his desk with the paused frame of Jamal lying on the highway. No note, no explanation. Only a campus statement calling it a tragic, unexpected loss. and a sheriff's department more than willing to let the implication stand that grief, not fear, had taken him. At Memorial Hermann Hospital, Jamal arrived under fluorescent lights and hurried voices. Paramedics tried everything, but the wounds were too deep, and the blood loss too severe. 18 minutes after arrival, his heart gave its final, tired push. When the attending physician typed the intake summary, the chart auto-filled his name as John Doe, possible impersonator. The words landed like a final insult. A man who had carried others out of the fire was now reduced to a question mark on a medical form. No military alert was sent. No next of kin was contacted. His body was moved quietly to a lower level, tagged, logged, and forgotten by everyone except the nurse who whispered. He deserved better. Before covering him with a clean sheet, back at the Harris County Sheriff's Office, Ethan Harper walked into the locker room with the posture of someone who believed he had nothing to fear. He slapped his locker shut, stretched his shoulders, and began telling the story with the confidence of a man who trusted his colleagues to protect him. "Guy reached for a gun," he said, loud enough for anyone to hear. "I handled it." His tone carried a smug pride that made two rookies exchange uneasy glances. Ethan bragged about the fake uniform, about catching a pretender, about cleaning up the road. Not once did he mention the ID. Not once did he mention the student he threatened. He spoke as if every word he said would be accepted without question. And for a moment, it seemed like he was right. No one challenged him. No one asked for details. The silence was a kind of approval. But not everyone was silent. Deputy Marcus Ram Ramirez stood at the far end of the benches with his head lowered, pretending to sort through his gear. He looked calm, but his thumb was hovering over the record button on his phone. Every word Ethan said was captured. The bragging, the laughter, the complete lack of remorse. Ram didn't record out of fear. He recorded out of duty. He recorded because the look on Jamal's face in those last seconds had lodged itself somewhere deep inside him. And he knew the truth, needed a witness who wouldn't disappear. When Ethan finished his performance and slammed his locker again, Ram quietly slipped out the side door, his face pale but determined. Sarah Harper heard the first rumors within an hour. She was at home, setting down a glass of wine on the kitchen counter when a friend from the department called her with a hesitant voice. "Did you hear? Ethan says his body cam was off. Maintenance issue." Sarah's hand froze. The glass slipped, hit the floor, and shattered. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her heart pounding in her throat, replaying the years of small moments she had brushed aside. The way Ethan stiffened when he saw black men in military uniforms. The way he joked at dinner about fakers in costume. The way he dismissed her questions with the sharp glare he inherited from his father. She sank into a chair, hands trembling, for the first time. She understood that the man she married was capable of something she had never wanted to imagine. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's main office, the public information officer drafted a statement that would be released within the hour. Justified shooting. Suspect matched the description of a known impersonator. The officer feared for his safety. Not a single line acknowledged the existence of the video. Not a single line mentioned the witness. The statement was crafted to close doors, not open them. But across the city, in a small apartment filled with stacks of research papers and a half-written manuscript, Lila Carter stared at her laptop screen in disbelief. Her fiancé, the man she planned to marry in the fall, had been killed less than 6 hours earlier, and the official narrative already felt like a burial of the truth. She clicked refresh again and again, watching the video links vanish one by one. Then her phone buzzed with a message from an anonymous number. "One file, one instruction. Save this before they take it." She opened it, and there it was. The original footage, unedited, unmistakable, Jamal offering his ID, Ethan refusing to look, the gunshots, the laughter, the student screaming from the overpass. He didn't reach for anything. Lila pressed a hand against her mouth to steady her breathing. Grief burned in her chest like a living thing, but beneath it was something sharper, purpose, determination, a promise forming in the quiet of her apartment. She whispered, "They will not erase you." And with steady hands, she saved the video in 5 different places. By the end of the night, the truth existed in only 2 forms: the hidden file on Lila's computer and the silent memory of General Lucas Reyes, who watched the footage alone in his office. When the final frame ended, Reyes didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply closed his eyes and felt the weight of a man who owed his life to someone the world had just thrown away. Somewhere in the hall, a glass conference table shattered under the force of Reyes slamming his fist down. The war for the truth had begun. By sunrise, the city woke to a roar it could no longer ignore. 1,000 people poured onto Interstate 45, not with slogans or megaphones, but with the quiet determination of citizens who understood that silence had already killed a man. They walked onto the highway in steady waves and sat down shoulder to shoulder, blocking all lanes from edge to edge. No speeches. No chaos. Just the weight of a community refusing to let the night swallow another truth. For 9 straight hours. The traffic came to a standstill. Commuters turned off their engines. Truckers stepped out of their cabs. Mothers held signs with trembling hands that read, "Honor the uniform," and he stopped to help. A pastor knelt at the center of the road and prayed for a nation that kept learning the same tragic lesson. All around him, people listened. No one shouted. No one moved. It was the kind of protest that carried a message without needing to raise a single voice. And far above them on an overpass, a woman placed a folded American flag on the railing, letting the wind lift its corner as if Jamal Washington himself were still standing beneath it. Inside the Harris County Sheriff's Office, the leadership responded with the cold efficiency of an institution trained to protect itself first. They released a statement that ignored every witness, every timestamp, and every shred of truth. Justified shooting. Officer perceived a threat. Suspect failed to comply. The words were crafted with the precision of a shield. Not a single mention of the military ID. Not a single acknowledgement that the video had ever existed. The message was clear. The department had drawn its line, and they expected the public to step back. But the public no longer trusted that line. And the moment the statement hit the airwaves, something inside the county snapped. People who had stayed quiet for years, teachers, veterans, nurses, retirees, began sharing their own stories of traffic stops gone wrong. The truth was no longer a spark. It was a fuse. Lila Carter sat at her desk with dark circles beneath her eyes, hands shaking from grief and exhaustion. Scrolling through Ethan Harper's private group chats she had managed to access through a colleague in digital forensics. What she found made her breath catch. The Blue Line Brotherhood, a closed group of officers who shared memes mocking soldiers of color, bragged about keeping the roads clean, and joked about wannabes in uniform. Ethan's name appeared again and again, chiming in with comments that revealed a long chain of hostility he'd kept hidden even from his wife. Lila read the messages slowly, each line cutting deeper than the last. She paused at one post where Ethan wrote, "One day I'm gonna stop a fake and not hold back." The date on the message was 5 months earlier. When she reached the bottom of the thread, her hands tightened until her knuckles turned white, whatever the sheriff's office claimed. Ethan had been waiting for an opportunity, and Jamal had simply been the man unlucky enough to cross his path, across the country, in a secured military office. General Lucas Reyes sat in silence before a large monitor. The original video played on loop, Every time he saw Jamal raise the ID card with steady hands, Reyes felt the same burning pressure in his chest, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, watching the 8 seconds again, the shots again, the laugh again, and when the final frame froze, showing Jamal's body collapsing onto the ground, something inside him gave way in one violent motion. He slammed his fist into the conference table, shattering the glass surface into a spray of sharp fragments. No one in the room dared to speak. They had never seen Reyes lose control. Not in battle, not in negotiation, not even in Fallujah. But today was different. Today, the man who once carried him out of fire had been murdered on American soil while wearing the uniform both of them had sworn to defend. Reyes stood, shoulders tense, jaw locked, and said only 4 words, Article 9, convene immediately. The officers around him froze. Article 9 was the line no one touched unless the nation's honor itself had been dragged into the dirt. It had not been invoked since 2001, and even then, only after the assassination of a Marine officer overseas. But Reyes did not waver. He repeated the order, and the room snapped into motion. Messages were sent across military channels, secure lines opened, classified protocols awakened like machinery that had been gathering dust. Article 9 was not symbolic. It was an action, a claim, a declaration that the military would assert jurisdiction when the justice system failed to defend one of its own. Down the table. Colonel Elena Vargas watched the frenzy with a tightness in her spine she could not hide. She respected Jamal. She admired him, but she feared what this move meant, as the room filled with overlapping voices and urgent footsteps. She rose, approached Reyes, and spoke quietly but firmly. General, once we start this, we cannot take it back. We will fracture every line between civilian and military authority. We will start a war between uniforms. We cannot become what we fear. Reyes turned, his expression carved from grief and fury. Colonel, they killed an active-duty soldier and tried to bury the truth. They mocked the uniform. They dishonored the oath. And they laughed. His voice lowered. You were not there when he carried me out of the fire. You did not feel what I felt today watching him die over and over again on a screen. This is not revenge. This is justice. Vargas met his eyes. Behind her resolve was a deep, trembling worry. Justice requires restraint, she said. We must not cross a line we cannot redraw. But the room was already shifting. Support for Article 9 was rising like a tide. Reyes held her gaze for a moment, then turned away, issuing new orders with a voice that left no room for debate. Outside the walls of the Pentagon, news outlets scrambled for information. Reporters whispered about an internal military motion. The sheriff's office denied everything, and families across the nation sat in their living rooms, watching anchors argue about protocol and procedure, while an entire country felt something stir. A growing sense that the world was about to witness a confrontation far larger than a single highway shooting. By nightfall, the determination of one general had overcome every objection. Article 9 was formally invoked for the first time in 22 years. The message was transmitted through encrypted channels to every base in the region. A new jurisdiction was declared, and in a quiet, dim hallway far from the commotion, Colonel Vargas stood alone, whispering to herself with a fear she could not silence. God help us all. What happened next would unfold in shadows, not in courtrooms. The hunt had begun. The moment Article 9 was invoked, the Army moved with a precision that left no space for hesitation. In a secured cyber operations room deep within Fort Cavazos, a team of quiet specialists sifted through fragments of corrupted data pulled from Harris County's servers. Hours passed with no sound except the steady tapping of keys and the low murmur of analysts verifying each recovered frame. And then, just after midnight, A technician called out in a strained voice. "I've got something." The dashcam file, previously declared malfunctioned beyond repair, came back to life. 7 seconds, clear, uncut, unmistakable. Ethan Harper holding Jamal's military ID under the beam of the cruiser headlights, staring at it long enough to understand exactly who stood before him, then raising his gun anyway. No threat, no weapon, no hesitation. The room fell silent as the footage looped. One of the analysts turned away with tears in her eyes. The truth was now indisputable. And with that truth came a level of resolve no one dared question. Across town. Sarah Harper sat on the edge of her bed, hands trembling around her phone. She had listened to the leaked audio from the locker room a dozen times. She had heard her husband brag about killing a faker. She had heard the laughter she once mistook for bravado. And she had heard the moment his voice shifted from pride to panic. Sarah's face was streaked with tears as she recorded a video under the soft lamp in the corner of the room. "My husband murdered a hero," she said, voice breaking in a way that made every word land with quiet force. "He knew what he was doing, and I need the world to know I will not defend him, not for a single moment." She hit upload. Within minutes, the video spread across platforms with a speed that matched the early hours of Jamal's death. For the first time, the shield around Ethan began to crack from the inside. When Ethan Harper learned about the recovery of the dashcam footage, he reacted with the instinct of a man who suddenly felt the ground open beneath him. He packed a duffel bag in frantic bursts, grabbing cash, clothes, his father's old revolver. He told himself he could still get ahead of this. He could leave before the world turned completely against him. He stumbled through the house, knocking over a lamp, wiping sweat from his brow using the back of his hand. Sarah's video was still playing on the downstairs television, her voice echoing through the room like a verdict he couldn't escape. Ethan's breathing grew shallow as he stepped outside into the humid Texas night. He got in the truck and pressed the accelerator hard, heading north on Interstate 45. His thoughts circled in a frantic whirl. He tried telling himself he shot a threat. He tried convincing himself he acted on training. But all of those excuses shriveled the moment he remembered Jamal's calm eyes and the ID he chose not to see. At Fort Cavazos. The command center was already tracking Ethan's movements. His license plate had pinged on a traffic camera outside Conroe. His phone grazed a cell tower near mile marker 118. General Reyes watched the tracker move across the map with a steady, unblinking stare. His voice carried a quiet gravity when he finally spoke. "Prepare the convoy." No one in the room questioned him. Operators moved with deliberate steps, gathering gear, checking weapons they hoped they wouldn't need, loading into 3 blacked-out Suburbans waiting on the tarmac. These were not police. These were not marshals. These were men who had served with Jamal, men who owed their lives to the kind of bravery he showed every day. They were not hunting a fugitive. They were carrying out a duty born from both law and loyalty. Ethan sped down the highway, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The road stretched ahead like a dark tunnel, and every mile seemed to carry him further from whatever future he once imagined. His father's voice echoed in his mind. The lessons drilled into him since childhood. The warnings about those people. The insistence that threats came wrapped in uniforms that didn't belong. Ethan had spent his whole life believing those words. And now, as the edges of panic closed in, he realized those beliefs had destroyed everything he had. His family, his job, the life he had built. He pressed harder on the gas, convinced he could outrun the consequences, but consequences had already found him. The 3 Suburbans approached from the south with their lights off, engines humming with controlled force. At mile marker 117, they fanned out with precision, one moving ahead of Ethan's truck, the other 2 aligning behind him in a smooth, coordinated box formation. Ethan's eyes widened as the headlights cut on in unison, washing the interior of his truck in a cold, blinding glare. He jerked the wheel, but the vehicles moved with fluid coordination, giving him nowhere to escape. Tires screeched. His truck swerved onto the shoulder before he could reach for the revolver in the glove box. The doors of all 3 Suburbans opened. 6 hooded operators moved toward the truck with the silent discipline of men trained to act without hesitation. They yanked open the driver's door, dragged Ethan out onto the pavement, and forced him face down, one knee in his back, his wrists bound before he could fully comprehend what was happening. Ethan gasped, cursing, pleading, insisting he didn't know who they were. The operators didn't answer. They didn't need to. Their silence carried more authority than any badge he had ever trusted. A loudspeaker cracked through the night, the familiar voice rolling across the empty highway with the calm force of a final judgment. General Lucas Reyes stepped out from the lead vehicle, his silhouette outlined against the headlights behind him. He moved slowly, with the weight of a man who had waited too long for this moment. As Ethan struggled on the ground, Reyes spoke in a measured tone that left no space for misunderstanding. "You killed the man who carried me 400 yards through fire." He paused, letting the words settle. "Now you carry his name." Ethan's breath caught, for the first time. He understood the scale of what he had provoked. This was not a department inquiry. This was not a media scandal. This was the judgment of the uniform he had insulted, the judgment of men who still believed in the honor he chose to ignore. The operators lifted Ethan to his feet and placed a black hood over his head. He felt the world narrow into darkness, his voice fractured into a whisper. "Please, don't do this." But his plea dissolved into the night without mercy. The Suburbans turned in formation and disappeared into the dark Texas horizon. The hunt was over. The reckoning had begun. Ethan Harper woke in a place where time and mercy no longer existed. His first breath tasted of metal, sand, and recycled air when he tried to sit up. The restraints pulled him back with a quiet authority that reminded him he was no longer in a world where his badge meant anything. The hood was gone. The room around him was bare concrete and steel, lit by a single overhead bulb that hummed with a steady pulse. No markings, no windows, no clocks. Only a reinforced door and a camera in the corner that watched him with the patience of something that never blinked. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the dryness in his throat. He whispered into the silence, "Where am I?" But the room offered no answer. It simply waited. For the first 6 hours, no one spoke to him. A tray of food slid through a narrow slot in the door. Ethan didn't touch it. He sat with his back against the wall, replaying the last 48 hours in a loop that only grew sharper with each pass. The dashcam footage, Sarah's video, the operators dragging him across the asphalt, the voice of General Reyes saying words that lodged into his spine like a blade. As the hours stretched, Ethan tried convincing himself he was a victim of some misunderstanding. He tried rehearsing the same story he told the sheriff's office. He reached for a weapon, but every time he said it in his mind, Jamal's calm face appeared, holding the ID card that Ethan had seen clearly and refused to acknowledge. Ethan pressed his hands over his ears, trying to drown out the truth. But truth, in that room, spoke louder than any lie. When the door finally opened, 3 officers entered without a word. Their uniforms carried no insignia, only rank bars. They placed a small tablet on the metal table in front of Ethan and pressed play. The screen lit up with Sarah Harper, her eyes swollen and voice shaking as she said, "My husband murdered a hero." Ethan flinched. He tried to look away, but one of the officers turned his chin back toward the screen with a steady hand. The video continued. Sarah's voice broke as she admitted she had seen signs for years, but never wanted to believe them. Ethan whispered, "Sarah, "Don't do this. Don't leave me like this." But the officers stood unmoved, watching his reaction with clinical precision. The screen shifted to his 12-year-old daughter, sitting on her bed with red eyes and a trembling jaw. "Daddy, why did you hurt that soldier?" Her voice cracked. "Why did you lie to people?" Ethan collapsed inward, a sound escaping him that barely resembled speech, when she whispered, "I don't want to see you again." Ethan's knees buckled, and he slid off the chair onto the concrete floor. The officers let the video finish, then left him there, curled in a position he had never allowed himself to show in his entire life. The door shut behind them with a finality that made his chest tighten. Hours later, the door opened again. This time, the screen showed his father standing in the dim light of their old garage. The man who taught him everything, every prejudice, every warning, every twisted lesson, stared at the camera with the same cold eyes Ethan had imitated for years. There was no speech, no explanation, only the slow, deliberate movement of his father lifting a shotgun, placing the barrel under his chin, and pulling the trigger. The screen went black. Ethan screamed, a raw, broken sound that echoed through the concrete walls. He pressed his forehead to the floor and begged for the images to stop. "Please, please, no more. I didn't mean for any of this. I just needed him to be right." That sentence, mumbled through tears, regret, and the collapse of everything he believed, was the moment his last layer of denial shattered. The officers returned, carrying a small metal chair, and placed Ethan in it. His wrists were bound, but his voice was free, and he used it not to defend himself, but to unravel through choked breaths. He said the words he had buried under years of inherited hate. "I saw the ID. I saw it clearly. I just couldn't let myself accept it. My dad told me men like him only wear that uniform to fool us. I wanted him to be right. One more time. Just one more time." The confession hung in the air with a weight no courtroom cross-examination could have created. In another room, behind a glass wall Ethan could not see, the Article 9 counsel sat in silence, listening to every word. These were high-ranking officers, men and women who had served with Jamal, bled beside him, survived because of him. Some sat with clenched fists, others closed their eyes to steady themselves. The confession confirmed what they already knew, but needed to hear from Ethan's own mouth. This was not fear. This was not confusion. This was a killing born from prejudice wrapped in the authority of a badge. Colonel Elena Vargas sat at the end of the long table, hands folded tightly as she watched the screen. She felt no satisfaction, only sorrow. She looked at Reyes, whose jaw was set so firmly the muscles in his neck strained. When the recording ended, the council members exchanged slow, heavy glances. The chair of the council, an aging general with eyes that had seen too much, asked the question that echoed through the chamber. "Does anyone vote to halt proceedings?" When silence answered. Vargas shook her head in resignation. One by one, 12 hands raised. Only one stayed down. Vargas whispered the words she had feared from the start, 12-0, with one abstention. The decision was final. Ethan Harper's fate was sealed. The officers stood, each carrying the solemnity of a verdict that would never appear in any court record. They filed out of the chamber with slow, deliberate steps. No cheers, no relief. Only the quiet understanding that justice sometimes lived in places the public never saw. Back in the cell, Ethan sat alone with the aftermath of his own words. His mind replayed the collapse of his family, the truth about his father, the face of the man he killed. He whispered into the empty room, "I'm sorry," but apologies no longer mattered. In the world above the sand, Sorrow did not erase the wound he had carved into a nation. The council had voted. The next step was the judgment. The underground chamber was prepared with the quiet efficiency of a place that had been designed for moments no one would ever speak about. Ethan Harper was led inside by two officers whose faces revealed nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no hesitation, only duty. He walked with the slow, uneven steps of a man who had cried himself empty. The restraints on his wrists were not tight, but they were firm enough to remind him that running was no longer part of his story. When the door shut behind him, the sound echoed like a long, final exhale. The glass chamber stood at the center of the room, circular, spotless, illuminated by a single ring of white light above, a table, a chair, nothing else. As Ethan was guided to the chair, he looked through the transparent walls and saw the officers who had entered moments before. 9 of them. Men and women whose names he didn't know, but whose faces he recognized from stories other officers told. The kind of stories reserved for warriors who had earned respect through sacrifice. Every one of them owed their life to an act of bravery associated with the same name, Jamal Washington. When the chamber sealed, Ethan felt a shift in the air, as if the room itself acknowledged what was about to happen. A low chime signaled the start of the proceedings. A senior officer stepped forward, holding a thin folder that contained the full Article 9 charge. His voice carried no hostility, only clarity. He read the accusation: the killing of an active-duty service member under circumstances that degraded the honor of the uniform. He read the evidence: the recovered dash cam showing Jamal presenting his ID, Ethan's own recorded confession, Sarah Harper's testimony, the private messages from the Brotherhood group, the long pattern of hostility. Ethan bowed his head, unable to hold the officer's stare, his shoulders trembling from memories he could not control. When asked whether he wished to respond, he could not lift his eyes. His voice came out as a faint whisper. "I was wrong." He repeated it again, louder. "I was wrong." The officers did not react. They were trained not to. But behind the glass pane where General Lucas Reyes stood, something unspoken passed across his expression. Not relief, not triumph, only sorrow. A sorrow for a man he had once believed the world would honor, not bury. Reyes listened with his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw locked tight as Ethan described the moment he chose violence. He spoke of his father's voice in his head, the prejudices he inherited, the belief he clung to like a shield. And then the part that broke whatever remained inside him. He showed me the ID. I saw it. I ignored it, because I didn't want to disappoint the man who raised me. His words drifted through the room like a confession made too late to save anything. At the 40-minute mark, the council chair looked down at the folder, closed it, and signaled to the 2 attending officers. The verdict required no deliberation. Article 9 was never designed for ambiguity. It was a measure created for clarity when the world refused to provide it. Ethan was escorted from the chamber to a narrow adjoining room with a single reinforced bed and a stainless steel gurney positioned against the wall. The light in this room was softer, quieter, almost gentle in the way it fell across the metal surfaces. Ethan sat on the bed, trembling, his breaths shallow and uneven. He looked up as the officers entered with steady, deliberate steps. "Please," he whispered, "tell my daughter her dad was wrong." One of the officers paused. It was the only moment of hesitation anyone would see that night. Then the order was carried out. Ethan Harper was placed on the gurney, his arms secured with careful precision. There were no cameras, no reporters, no witnesses beyond the 9 officers and the general who watched from behind the glass. A medic approached, inserting the IV with the calm professionalism of someone who had done this before, but never for a case like this. Ethan closed his eyes. His chest rose and fell with a slow, resigned rhythm. His last words repeated in a whisper, more breath than sound. "Tell her I was wrong." The sedation entered his veins first, relaxing the muscles in his face. The second injection quieted his breathing. The third stopped it completely. The machine monitoring his vitals released one steady tone, then fell silent. The room did not move for several long seconds. The air felt heavier, as if acknowledging what had taken place. There were no cheers, no cold satisfaction, only a quiet respect for the man whose death had brought them here. Then, in accordance with the protocol, 2 officers stepped forward to check for a pulse, another verified time of death. The gurney was disconnected from the machines, and Ethan Harper's body was transferred to a small adjoining chamber where a simple industrial cremator waited. No ceremony, no folded flag, no final salute. The officers carried him with the same solemnity they would have given any human life, placing him onto the platform and stepping back in silence. The flames began. No one turned away. Even General Reyes held his position, watching the fire reflect against the window. It was not a celebration. It was a closing of a chapter written in fear, hate, and irreversible tragedy. Within minutes, the body was ash, collected into a container without markings. At dawn, 2 officers drove the ashes to a remote landfill where military waste was typically discarded. They walked together into the early morning light, took one last breath of the cool air, and opened the container. The ashes scattered with the wind, disappearing into the quiet stretch of land as if the earth itself was reclaiming what remained of a broken man. There was no press release, no official statement, no public acknowledgement that Article 9 had ever been invoked. The world believed Ethan Harper had fled, vanished, or taken his own life. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and none of them would ever speak it. Behind the silence, a deeper truth remained. Justice, when carried out in the shadows, still carried its weight. And the weight of that night settled heavily on every shoulder in the room. Above the chamber, General Reyes walked down the dim corridor, each step deliberate. He paused at the elevator, closing his eyes for a moment. In the quiet of that underground hallway, he spoke the name that had driven every decision. Jamal. We did what they would not. His voice softened. May the nation remember you better than they treated you. The proceedings took exactly 42 minutes. 42 minutes to close the story Ethan created. 42 minutes to honor the man Ethan destroyed. The news of Jamal Washington's death did not fade the way the sheriff's office hoped it would. It moved through the country with a quiet persistence, finding its way into living rooms, veteran halls, church basements, and late-night kitchen tables where families whispered about a man they had never met but somehow felt they knew. The military kept its silence. The sheriff's department doubled down on its lies. But the people who cared about truth kept pushing, and the story refused to die. At Fort Cavazos, the main briefing room, once an ordinary space filled with projectors and folding chairs, now bore a new name stenciled in clean black letters across the wall: Washington Hall. Soldiers who walked past the sign slowed their steps without meaning to. They understood the weight behind the name. Jamal was the kind of man the Army rarely produced and never forgot. Lila Carter stood at the front of that room 6 months after Jamal's death, answering questions from journalists with the calm determination of someone who had carried her grief long enough to shape it into purpose. Her book, a detailed account of Jamal's life and the corrupt system that tried to erase him, sold 1.8 million copies in its first month. She didn't write it for profit. She wrote it because the world needed to understand who Jamal had been. Not a headline, not a controversy, a man of discipline, loyalty, and quiet humility. Every page was a promise to him. and every interview she gave was a reminder that silence would never again be allowed to bury his name. She stood with her shoulders straight, her voice steady, and carried the story forward with the honor Jamal lived by. In Congress. The momentum that had once stalled began to shift. Legislators who usually disagreed on everything found themselves sitting at the same table, reviewing footage, reports, and testimony that Lila and General Reyes provided behind closed doors. What began as a proposal quickly hardened into law, the Jamal Washington Body Camera Act, under the new mandate. Every law enforcement officer in the United States was required to activate their body cam the moment they made contact with any vehicle displaying military plates or any individual wearing a uniform. No exceptions, no loopholes, no excuses. Departments that violated the rule would lose federal funding. Officers who tampered with footage would face automatic felony charges. The bill passed with overwhelming support. Even representatives who rarely acknowledged the struggles of military families found themselves unable to vote against the name of a man who died helping a stranger change a tire. General Reyes attended the signing ceremony without the medals he usually wore. He stood behind the president with his hands folded, the memory of Jamal carrying him through flames lingering behind his eyes. When the pen touched the paper, Reyes felt a pressure in his chest ease in a way he had not expected. He did not smile. He simply bowed his head, whispered Jamal's name, and let the moment settle. Across Texas. Changes took shape in quiet ways. At mile marker 117, the stretch of I-45 where Jamal took his last breath, a small steel sign was installed by order of the Army Corps of Engineers. No ceremony. No cameras, just a simple, dignified marker that carried 8 words, in memory of Major Jamal Washington, and beneath it, in smaller lettering, he changed a tire here, he changed a nation here. Drivers who passed the sign slowed without being told. Veterans saluted as they rolled by. Mothers whispered explanations to their children. Nobody needed flashing lights or painted tributes. The simplicity of the marker carried a gravity that made people quiet their voices and steady their hands on the wheel. Every year, on the anniversary of Jamal's death, something remarkable happened without anyone planning it. Traffic near mile marker 117 began to drop to 20 miles per hour. No announcements, no official reminders. It happened because people remembered hundreds of drivers, from truckers to families on road trips, eased their speed as they approached the sign. No horns, no honking, just a long, steady procession of vehicles moving in quiet respect for a man they never met, but whose story had touched them in ways they could not fully explain. Old soldiers would nod solemnly. Young families would roll down their windows. Some placed small flags on the shoulder of the road. Others simply drove slower, letting the silence speak for them. In Houston's 3rd Ward, Eleanor Washington sat on her porch with a framed picture of her son resting on her lap. Her eyes carried a sorrow that would never fully heal, but also a strength that rarely wavered. Neighbors stopped by with food, flowers, or brief words of comfort. Eleanor didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. "My son served this country with honor," she said one afternoon, her voice steady. "And now this country finally knows his name." The community around her held on to those words. They made sure the world understood that no law, no book, and no signed proclamation meant more than the quiet legacy of a man who lived with integrity, Sarah Harper, living alone in a small apartment far from Houston, carried a different burden. She had divorced Ethan, changed her last name, and begun the slow process of rebuilding a life shaped by guilt she didn't deserve. One night, she sent Lila a letter, not asking for forgiveness, but offering a truth she felt needed to be spoken. "Your fiancé saved a version of my family I didn't know I needed." She wrote, "His story forced me to confront the lies I lived with. Because of him, My daughter will grow up understanding what real courage looks like. Lila read the letter twice, then folded it gently and placed it inside her journal next to a picture of Jamal. As for the military, the silence surrounding Article 9 remained undisturbed. No documents were released, no investigations were noted. The world would never learn what happened to Ethan Harper, but everyone who mattered understood that justice had been carried out. Even if the details remained buried beneath the sand, the officers who stood in that underground chamber never spoke of it again. They carried the memory the way soldiers carry the weight of every battle, quietly, respectfully, and with the understanding that not all acts of justice belong in the light. In the end, the nation didn't remember the controversy. They remembered the rule Jamal left behind, a simple standard that reshaped how law enforcement approached the uniform he wore with pride. Before you draw on a soldier, you prove the threat. You do not assume it because of the color of his skin. And since that night on Interstate 45, not a single American service member in uniform had been shot dead during a traffic stop. Jamal Washington had carried 11 men out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah. Now, in his death, he had carried a nation into a better light. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, please take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and share where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these stories alive.